afternoon service.
Amen.
We'll continue our lesson this afternoon from Genesis chapter 39 and Genesis chapter 40 as we're studying through and looking at some of the lessons that we can learn from the life of Joseph, and just some reminders. We talked about how that we can learn from Joseph's life that God is with us even when we're lonely sometimes. Even when we feel like we're alone. You remember Joseph being sold by his brothers into slavery after they had really decided to kill him. Of course, one of the older brothers stepped in and said, "No, we don't need to do that, so let's sell him." They sold him into slavery. He's taken by these people that he doesn't know to a place that he doesn't know, and he feels alone. But he remained faithful. And we see there in verse 2 that the Lord was with Joseph of Genesis chapter 39. And God is with us. God is with us as Christians, even when we might feel like we are alone. We also learned that even though God is with us, it doesn't mean we're not going to go through trials and afflictions sometimes. Just like Joseph, he was a good example of that. He was faithful, and God was with him, and he still went through those various trials. We also learned that although trials and afflictions come our way, we can still be faithful. We can still be godly people. And we're expected to do that. We don't need to give in. We also learned from Joseph as he is tried there with Potiphar's wife, and he makes the point there. He says, "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And we talked there that the lesson we learned is that all sin ultimately is against God. It's sin against God. Even if we try to make it out to be different in our minds, even if we try to justify it in our heads, trick ourselves into thinking that we're okay with whatever it is still sin against God. We talked about how there's always a way of escape. And just as Joseph fled, left his garment, got out of there, and escape that temptation, that trial, when we are faced with various trials, there's an escape. We just have to be looking for them. We've got to be prepared, ready for those moments as Christians. The last thing we talked about is that sometimes as Christians, we may be punished by the world for doing the right thing. That happens a lot of times. You see that so much with grown men and women who literally will sometimes try to make you look as bad as they can because you're the one doing the right thing. And so that happens. We've got to be ready for that. And we learned that from looking at the life of Joseph. A couple other things that we'll look at this evening. Number one, as we read through and we see, in every situation, God was with Joseph and helped him to succeed in whatever he was doing. So at first, he sold into slavery. Well, guess what? God was with him. So much, he succeeded so much that he eventually became, as you see there, Joseph had been brought down to Egypt. Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. And we go on and we see that Joseph literally became in charge of all of his possessions to the point that Potiphar didn't worry about anything. He didn't even check anything. He was so dependent upon Joseph and the work that Joseph did because he was so good and succeeded in what he was doing for Potiphar that he didn't have any worries about it at all. Everything in his house and everything was under the watch of Joseph. He cared for all of it, and Potiphar has said that all he worried about was, what am I going to eat next? What's my next meal going to be? And so you see that even in those times where Joseph was struggling, man, can you imagine being sold into slavery by your own family, who honestly wanted to kill you, no longer able to see your parents anymore, no longer with the people that you know, no longer in the place that you know, and yet Joseph has good to come from that. And you see later on as he's tried by Potiphar's wife there, and he flees from her. Well, she turns around and says, here's his garment, and tried to turn it on him as he was the one plotting whatever they were going to do. And so he says, we see that he ends up what? Potiphar became mad, and he throws him in prison. Well, guess what happens when he gets into prison? The keeper of the prison trusted Joseph after some time so much, because God was still with Joseph, that he put him over all of it. He put him over all the prisoners, and he didn't have any cares, any worries, because Joseph was in charge. And so we see that good coming from it. And as you study on, if you remember, you can really see the providence of God working in Joseph in his life. To the point that if you recall later on, he interprets their dreams, right? And of the famine and the drought that was going to be coming. And so the Egyptians were able to get ahead of it, and they became the source for all food for anybody that was around them. And guess who ended up moving into Egypt? Well, his other brothers, right? His brothers, they come, and his father, they come looking for food and help. And guess who's there to welcome them in? Joseph. And it's an amazing thing to see, because you can see through all of this, God working his providence, because guess what group of people started there? The Israelites. God's own people. The Israelites grew and grew and grew, and God was able to make, even though Joseph was struggling and went through these different trials and afflictions and persecutions as a slave, God was able to make something good out of that for him. And I think he can do the same for us. I really do. Romans chapter 8, verse 28 through 30 says, we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. And it can be encouraging to us to know that. You know, with things going on, how many times have you had something you couldn't understand? It's like, I don't understand why this is happening to me. But later on, even if it's years down the road, you see the bigger picture. That happens a lot. And when it's all said and done, if we endure, if we stay the course and remain faithful to God, we know it's going to work together for good, because we will be in heaven one day. And that's ultimately the best thing that can happen for us. But he says, we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. And so it's a wonderful thing to know that we can learn from Joseph that all things are going to work together for good to those who are faithful to God. Another point is that we can learn from Joseph that we should never blame God. We should never curse God. We should never put the blame on God for the things happening in our lives, the trials and afflictions. Joseph never did that, not one time. He looked for the good in every situation that he could. And obviously he worked hard, and he got to the point where he was successful in whatever situation he was in. We see that with Job as well. But Genesis chapter 50 verse 20 says, As for you meant evil against me. Joseph speaking of his brothers there, but God meant it for good. He understood the good that came out of it to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. Joseph knew, okay? And Joseph was okay with the little bit of struggle that he had to go through for the good that came from it. James chapter 1 verses 2 to 4 says, Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. I remember studying this in our midweek build-up that we had on Wednesday nights during the first of the pandemic, when we were not meeting on Wednesday night. And we went through the book of James, and it's a interesting thing to read that we should count it all joy when we are met with trials of various kinds, right? rest of what he says here in verses 2 through 4, it makes sense. You count it joy because you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And it says, let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. You see, when we go through these trials of different kinds, and we endure through that, we come out from that, we're better for it. We're stronger. You think about some of the toughest times you've been through in your life. And once you, no doubt, struggle in those moments, and you try, and you just wonder sometimes, am I ever going to get over this funk? Am I ever going to get out of this? Am I going to make it, why is this happening to me? But eventually you make it out on the other side. How much more faithful do you feel like you could be in that moment if you put your trust in God? We can't put the blame on God for these things. Joseph sure did. Next point is that sometimes it takes time. We like to have things in a moment. We don't like waiting. But sometimes God says we've got to wait. Sometimes it takes time, just like it did with Joseph, to see the whole picture. Eventually, his brothers come back, and he's with his family, reunited with his father, and he loves them, and he's so happy to see them, and it's all working out for him again. But it took a lot of time to get to that point. Genesis chapter 41, verse 46 says, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh, went through all the land of Egypt. So you can imagine the time that, once he was sold from a young boy by his brothers, it took all those years. And Joseph went through that all those years. But he made it out a better man and a better person, faithful to God, no doubt. Sometimes it takes time, right? And we can't try to take it into our own hands while we wait. Think about Abraham and Sarah as God had promised them a son. And they got tired of waiting, right? And they started to wonder, and of course Abraham ended up having a child with Hagar, the handmaiden. And God said, that's not how it works. That was not my promise, And God's promise was eventually fulfilled, and they could see that happen. So we've got to be willing to let it take time sometimes. And when we're in the middle of those trials and afflictions, we get through them. It might take a while, but we just got to endure through that. Joseph, we also learned from him the spirit of forgiveness. You see later on in chapter 45 when his brothers come that, you can imagine they see Joseph now as one of the head of Pharaoh's house and of all of Egypt, right? And it's like, what's going to happen now that his brothers are coming? And you can imagine they felt like he might be ready to get them back, some vengeance, right? Excuse me. But that wasn't at all what we see. Joseph had the spirit of forgiveness. And Matthew 18, verses 21 to 23, Jesus says, Then Peter came up and said to him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? How often am I supposed to forgive somebody who has done wrong against me? And Jesus says, as many as 7 times is the question he was asked. Jesus said to him, I did not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. He says you forgive him. And the whole point is to have this spirit, this heart of forgiveness. Okay? And if you think about it, who are we? Who are we to hold a grudge or hold something against someone else? When you consider the wrong that we have in our lives, but yet we still expect God to forgive us of those things freely and willingly. Excuse me. The last point I want to make that we learned from Joseph, and we talked about this a little minute ago, but as we study through, this would be wonderful material for a Bible class over a period of time, but as you study through and you see throughout time, the time of Joseph's life, even all that he went through, you see the providence of God working, and it all works out in the end. see God's providence still being at work in the life of Joseph and still being at work in our lives today. And so, no doubt, God uses us. God uses us as His workers, as His servants. And His providence can be seen through the things that we do and the good that comes from the work that we do this very day. So, we think, is God's providence working in our lives? Are we allowing God to be seen through us? Are we allowing His work to be done in the things that we say and in the things that we do? Just as Joseph did. He was willing to work for God. In whatever situation he was in, he was willing to work for God. And I hope that we can say the same thing. I appreciate your attention this morning and this afternoon as we've studied about the life of Joseph and all the things that we can learn from his life. And I hope that we can take these things and really apply them to our lives today as we go about our daily lives and our jobs or around people out in the world and the things that we say and the things that we do, so that ultimately God can be glorified, because that's the whole point of it. So appreciate your attention. We have the opportunity now. The Lord's invitation is always open. If you have the need to put on Christ in baptism, we want to encourage you to do that today. We'd love to assist you with that. Maybe you're already a Christian, but if there is sin in your life, sin that has separated you from God, and maybe you have the desire to make that right, we want to encourage you not to wait any longer, because that's not a state that you want to stay in. Okay? But God is willing to forgive you. We're willing to forgive and pray for you. And if you need prayers from the congregation here, you can just let us know. If you're something in any way, won't you let us know as we stand aside.